So Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is the sequel to the first Five Nights at Freddy's film based on the popular video game. And I will say this about the sequel. The best thing to say about it is that it is much more functional than the first film, because there are like aspects of the film that, even though it still has all the same problems, like it's a messy mash of video game lore and sloppy logic and uninteresting characters, but there are moments where it almost finds that kind of that spooky groove of a horror film about haunted robots. There are a few scenes in there where I was kind of surprised, like, okay, they're getting a little bit closer to making me a little bit more engaged with Five Nights at Freddy's. But it's few and far between, because for every fairly good scare or well-edited nightmare sequence there is in the film, there are at least two other scenes in the light of just characters I don't care about, with dialogue that is terrible, and so many inconsistencies in the tone and story that just kept taking me out of the film. And I think the biggest problem with the sequel is that the biggest sore thumb that I think this film series has is the protagonist of Mike, played by Josh Hutcherson, who you might remember from the first film as the hapless security guard who is trying to care for his younger sister Abby, once again here played by Piper Rubio, and just longing to figure out what happened to his brother who went missing, and trying to kind of figure that out with dream logic. It feels like with this sequel they kind of removed all the interesting aspects of Mike, because Mike was not that interesting of a character to begin with, but he did have some components to him that I did find interesting. Like I loved the backstory about how his brother went missing. I loved how he would lose his temper about trying to defend children. I thought those were interesting aspects, but I don't think the first film, played with those elements well, and just kind of made him more of a passenger in that story instead of a participant. And Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is very much the same way. Mike still feels like he's so distant from it. It just feels like he's on a roller coaster here. He's not meant to interact with anything. He doesn't get to do as much. Even when the film does find something for Mike to do with solving the new mystery of Freddy Fazbear Pizza, they kind of like prevent him from having any more development than that, because there's one scene where he's given a phone number to call to figure out the truth about what's happened with like the 1980s history of Freddy Fazbear Pizza, and he does call that number and he does figure out some juicy details off screen. The one scene where it felt like Mike would have been like a really good sleuth in this film is kept entirely off screen in what I imagine is either a deleted scene or as a little Easter egg where you personally have to call the number and you can hear what Mike hears, which I really hope that's not the case here. I'm not going to call that number to figure it out. But Mike is trying to recover after the events of the first Five Nights at Freddy's film. Abby is still trying to get over. She still hasn't gotten over the robots. She still views them as her friends, even though they were all pretty murderous to the intruders at Freddy Fazbear Pizza. But Abby still has a soft spot for the robots that helped her build a fort one night, so she wants to get back there. And I can kind of understand why she would still be obsessed. She's a little kid. A lot of kids are obsessed with Five Nights at Freddy's. I get that aspect of her character, and I thought that was believable. What was less believable was how Mike and the returning character of Vanessa, played by Elizabeth Lally, who is the daughter of William Afton and still hasn't gotten over that her dark past with her father. Apparently, Vanessa and Mike are suspected of being a couple, but it's like not really. And here's what I hate about this film, about the characters, is that they are so one track and boring that there isn't much to them. Like, we're supposed to believe that Mike and Vanessa might be a couple, but they go out on a date, and before they do, Mike keeps stressing like, "Oh, it's not a date. It's not a date. We're not an item. We're not a date." And of course, in any other film, that would be the setup to establishing that they do have a relationship. A very romantic relationship that they're not quite sure about, and they're still trying to figure it out as they go. But they have zero romantic chemistry in this film. I'm sorry. They go out they go out on a date and they are so boring that they have nothing to talk about besides, Mike is doing some painting at his house, but they don't really talk about that. Vanessa is taking a cycling class, but they really don't talk about that. They spend most of their time talking about the Freddy, the Freddy restaurant and the dream logic of trying to figure out their hideous past. And it's like, is that all there is to them? Is there nothing else going on in their lives besides just everything that relates to Freddy Fazbear Pizza and the killer animatronics and the ghosts that still haunt them? Like, I get that's the main focus. But if you're setting up like, a date where they might have a connection, there's gotta, it can't just be an exposition dump there. There's got when the waiter who keeps coming to the table and keeps brushing the crumbs off the table has more personality than both of these central characters, that's a huge problem. Like, the waiter has more quirks than they do. Mike really didn't have to explain to everybody that he's not a couple with Vanessa, just 'cause he's so dull and boring and free of emotion. Like, he doesn't even really focus on, being angry or sad about his brother, and he just spends most of the film just investigating the mystery without much reaction from him. He's an empty vessel. And I really wish that I could like that character, because he should be an audience surrogate. He should be like someone who's just discovering all this for the first time and trying to figure it out and having appropriate reactions to everything that could make you be more invested in him. But nope, he's just, there to he's just there to solve the case and nothing more. Now, where the film actually succeeds, though, I think is in the villain they establish, because the villain they ultimately have to defeat here is Charlotte, who is a ghost of one of the murdered children at Freddy Fazbear in the 1980s. And I like this character a lot more than William Afton or the ghost children who inhabited the animatronics of the first film, because I still cannot tell you the motivations for why William Afton needs to maintain his murderous Muppet factory, but I can tell you the motivations of Charlotte. I know what she's doing. I know how she's doing it. I know the events that led up to why she wants to slaughter all the adults. It makes sense. I don't think it's that unique, but I know what she's trying to do here. So Charlotte is able to not only control other robots, but she is able to possess human bodies in this kind of like marionette puppet form, which I found kind of cool, because when she actually gets into human bodies, she gives them these kind of like glowing light eyes, and she has like these colorful streaks that come down her cheek, and she kind of has like this kind of like floating aspect as though she's like on strings the whole time. I love the look whenever she gets into a body. Like for a good chunk of the film, she's possessing the body of McKenna Grace's character, and I just love the look of her. I love the way she moves. I love her tone. I love the way she kind of like tries to scare people and surprise them. I just love everything about that. That's a really good villain. And I wish the film would focus more on Charlotte as a villain, like trying to address her, trying to understand her. But, and you probably know what I'm going to say here, everything else in the film feels like it's working against this. There's all these references and all the, trying to line everything up here, trying to, throw in as much, Five Nights at Freddy's lore as possible here, which I think is very much due in part to, the video game's creator here of Scott Cawthon solely writing this film, as opposed to, working with a few other writers like in the first film. He's in charge here, and it very much feels like, yeah, he knows how to insert scary scenes and, all these references to the games, but writing dialogue, nah, the date between Mike and Vanessa just doesn't work. And even for like the other characters that he establishes here, like you have Wayne Knight, who's playing the science teacher, who's very, anti-animatronics. He doesn't like Freddy Fazbear, so he's pretty much like Freddy fodder. And then you have Skeet Ulrich, who is just divulging the more about the murder case and little else than that. He's basically just there for an exposition dump. I felt like if there's all these other aspects where I feel like, it's not that complicated. Like, Charlotte doesn't feel like she's that cryptic as William Afton, where like I felt like if the film just focused on her and trying to figure out the mystery and trying to figure out what is going on at this other Freddy Fazbear, I think that could have been a pretty good film. But the fact that it has to incorporate all these other aspects of like the first film, and bring in all these other references from the games, and not to mention set up all these other subplots that just kind of peter out. Like at one point, Abby makes another friend in her school, which seems like it would run counter to how she still views the animatronics of Freddy Fazbear as her friends that she feels she can't visit anymore. And I was wondering, like, okay, is that going to play up with how she has this new friend at school, but then it really doesn't? There's also another big twist that is revealed with William Afton and with Vanessa that I thought was going to play up. I thought was going to play around with the aspect of Charlotte wanting to kill all the adults in this town. I feel like there's a lot of material that you can work with there, but it just feels squandered. It just feels like the big reveal here. It just feels like a soap opera twist that they reveal at the end of this film, and very abruptly. It just feels like, oh, here's all these other twists, and we're going to set up all these other cameos and subplots that might pay off in the next film, but not in this film. And, for a film that it has a lot of lore and a lot of mystery to it, it has like some surprising holes in it, because the whole idea behind this film is that there's another Freddy Fazbear Pizza, which is apparently within not even driving, like biking distance from where Mike and Abby are currently living. That's just like, wait, why didn't Vanessa mention this? And that there are other animatronics there, and that there's this other hideous history there. And even like, the film is just so clunky and how it tries to frame everything. Like, the whole town has apparently embraced like Freddy Fazbear Pizza as like their kind of like spooky icon of their community. So they have a whole festival of Freddy Fazbear Pizza, and it's like, why? Like, I know why they do it for bringing in like the other animatronics so that they can mill about the town without a lot of people taking notice, being like, wait, why are there robots running around here? They could say, oh, it's part of the Freddy Fest or whatever. But it's like, couldn't you do that with Halloween? Because you would think if the entire town has embraced the Freddy, the Five Nights at Freddy's as like their obsession and the lore of this town, wouldn't there be like haunted tours of the two locations in this town? There is like a very interesting like ghost hunter section, but that just feels like it's just there so that the film can fulfill its murder quota for the animatronics here, which I will admit it is nicely staged here. And that's probably the best thing I can say about the film, is that it does have some very spooky scenes that are staged here. I love the whole idea of the ghost hunters going into Freddy Fazbear and ultimately getting murdered there. I thought that was very well set up. It has some decent frights and some unexpected twists that go along with it. I thought that was a pretty cool sequence. I also really love the nightmare sequence where Vanessa is still hallucinating visions of William Afton, once again played by Matthew Lillard. I thought that was really cool, and I was interested to see where that was going to go. It goes nowhere. It might be setting up something for the next film, but it's just like, oh, here's a little weird sequence with some spooky imagery and a few cameos of stuff from the games, and then it's gone. On to the next like spooky scene, which may or may not be building momentum here. Now, I know that a big draw of the film is going to be, are there references to the games? And yes, there are plenty of those. Like, if you are going into the film with that laundry list of stuff it's going to mention from the games, yeah, even though I have not played all the games, I can tell you, yes, there are a few references. There is one sequence in the film that does feel like it is trying to directly replicate the gameplay of one of the Five Nights at Freddy's games, which I thought the first film would do. I thought the first film would kind of like lean into, keeping an eye on the security cameras and making sure that, the animatronic monsters don't try to kill you. That's a good idea for like maybe like a short film. And they do incorporate that into the film here, but it kind of feels like too little too late, and they kind of don't even they don't even set it up in like an interesting way where it's like a character. They do set up all the plot elements for Mike to be engaged in that sequence, but they don't really provide it in they don't really set it up in an organic way. They just kind of like shove him in there, and he just kind of like naturally kind of figures out the components of the Five Nights at Freddy's games from there. I like this film more than the first Five Nights at Freddy's film, but that's only because there's a few more sequences that are pretty good and they get closer to becoming the horror film that I think this movie is trying to be. It is almost there, but it always feels held back, not just by references, but also, attempts at levity that just fall flat. Like there's a lot of lukewarm punchlines in this film with funny lines that could be funny in a vacuum, but they're just jarring the way that they're delivered in this film. Like at one point, like there's supposed to be a humorous line where somebody just kind of views Mike as being a little bit rude. And she just says like, oh, what an asshole. It's like, really? Mike, this dull as dishwater, emotion-free guy who barely reacts to anything, that guy's an asshole? Like, yeah, I get it. It's funny to call people assholes, but it's like, Mike's not an asshole. He's the dullest person in this film. How could you view him like that? Not to mention, I won't spoil it, but there is one returning character who has this one punchline, which is made to make you go, oh, I recognize that character. He was from the first film. But then you think about the punchline for 1 minute and you're just like, wait, why would the character say that in this moment here? And I think that it speaks to how detached this film is from feeling like an actual horror film and not just like a smattering of video game references with a little bit, some attempts at levity here and there in between all of the spooky stuff. And then just forgetting about subplots as it goes along. So, I really wish I could like this film. I do like it more than the first film, but the first film was just a mess of, a lot of elements that really didn't work here. And the sequel, it is making improvements. There is stuff that works here, but it feels like, it's just another video game film that feels like less of a coherent narrative and just more like a rattling of references to please gamers who come in with their franchise laundry list, where basically where a circus baby cameo will trump, compelling characters or a consistent tone, because the film just never finds its groove. Like there are sparks of brilliance here and there, but it just never quite comes together. And instead of making all of that pay off, it just kind of ends abruptly and then just throws in like an Easter egg for the next film. So yeah, I was really disappointed in Five Nights at Freddy's 2. I wasn't as dismayed with the first film. There's clearly some potential here, but it still feels like it's being squandered for just, adhering as closely to the games and just trying and failing to make compelling characters. Like, the robot characters, they look good. The visual effects are pretty neat. And there's some okay kills and, some setups, some spooky settings and some spooky murders. All that stuff is okay. But I really did not care about any of the characters here, especially when they're trapped in this story that has so many plot holes and inconsistencies, and it's just built more for just referencing everything that fans know and just not really giving them anything else. Like I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating here. A good film might give fans what they want, but a great film will give fans something they never knew they wanted. And I don't think that's what's being done here with Five Nights at Freddy's 2. I feel like it's just giving, and maybe this is just my perspective as someone who wasn't really a big fan of Five Nights at Freddy's, but it just feels like it's giving the fans all like all of the references and the lore dumps and the ambiguity meant for, more YouTube theory videos, and not really making a cohesive film there. And I understand like a lot of people will probably like that aspect of the ambiguity and how it sets up and how it will set up different theories and give you more to munch on, but respectfully, this is not like a David Lynch film or a Panos Cosmatos film where there's all these other, components to consider and, to debate on in the mind. It's just a mess of story elements that kind of peter out or don't pay off or are not as fulfilling or not as clever. And it's just leaving it up to the viewer to try to like put all the pieces together. It feels less like a contemplation of a film that is trying to say a lot and more of just like a shattered machine or puzzles where you have to put all the pieces together, even if a lot of the pieces are missing and not quite there. So, yeah, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, it's better than the first film, but the first film is just a mess, and it's more of a mess, but a little bit more coherent here and there.